I was having a discussion about the paint output of the Tenta Brella and Nautilus with my friends from High Tide Rush. One of the points one of them made was that Tent paints a lot, and considering I am a Tent main, I think I could have something useful to offer, so I wanted to dive into that. If we start painting the training area in the lobby with the Tenta Brella, it becomes pretty obvious that, yeah, its paint output is pretty significant, and it can paint a large area pretty damn quickly. But there are variables here that we need to consider that will change how the weapon paints in an actual battle. For instance, what are the positions in a game that Tents usually want to play in? Typically they'd want to play relatively close to the action because they're really good at drawing attention to themselves for a long period of time without dying due to their shield. With that being said, this makes it so that it does not have the freedom to paint that, say, a Hydrant would typically have. But I want you to put a pin in this for a moment while I talk about a few other variables of Tent's paint output. Once again, Tents can paint well in an optimal condition, but one of the main drawbacks of the weapon is its not insignificant downtime. Each shot takes some time to come out, and once you've considered that a Tent without any Inksaver main can only shoot 9 times on a full ink tank, they're going to need to spend a lot of time refilling their ink tank. And that's not even taking into consideration them using their shield, which takes a whopping 30% of the ink tank to release. Along with that, Tenta Brellas have a pretty large amount of lag after pretty much any action. With this in mind, if a Tent were to spend its time painting the ground instead of making game-changing plays, that would leave the player pretty vulnerable, needing to adjust to a dangerous situation very rapidly to defend itself with much less resources. So spending a significant portion of time to painting alone is often not a great idea. In a similar situation, the Nautilus can be painting, but it still has the freedom to fight back as it is a more versatile weapon. One of the big things we'd also need to consider is how a Tent actually paints, so let's take some time to discuss that. A Tenta Brella paints by firing a bunch of small pellets in front of it, leaving a fairly long line of paint in front of the player. This cannot be changed by turning. Firing will always end in a straight line. In theory, this gives it a great advantage over other weapons, but this is not actually the case in actual battles. Right here I have set up a scene simulating a more realistic battlefield. If I were to try to paint over this area with the Tenta Brella optimally, I need to align myself to get the most turf while using up the least amount of ink and time, which would look something like this. But even while painting optimally, I still had a much lower paint output while using the same amount of ink consumption. Compare that to how other weapons paint. A shooter has a lot more freedom while painting because they can direct each one of their shots at a different part of the ground while also using less of their ink tank. Something that even Nautilus does better than Tent in this scenario, as it has the freedom to choose where and when it paints. Now let's take a pin out of that scenario from earlier. In an optimal scenario, Tenta Brellas will be using their resources to protect and assist their teammates, which can at times include painting for them. But even in this optimal scenario, the total paint output isn't really that big. A Tent's shield is really threatening and needs quite a lot of attention once deployed, drawing more attention towards the Tent player and away from the rest of the team, which can be really helpful for pushing objectives like the Rainmaker. However, doing this takes up a lot of resources. Resources is a word I want to focus on. At the end of the day, Tents do have the ability to paint a lot. However, once we consider realistic battlefield conditions, the usual Tent positioning, the downtime the weapon has, and the optimal role of a Tenta Brella, we realize that playing the Tenta Brella takes a lot of commitment to every move, and commitment takes resources. Resources that would be much better placed elsewhere to have a greater impact on the game, which is why weapons like Tent love to play alongside weapons that can paint an equal or greater amount while also using less resources, especially if the weapon's primary role is to paint. Now, neither the Tent nor the Nautilus have the painting ability they'd love to have, but these are just a few drawbacks of the weapon that are important to consider when choosing to play the weapon. I hope I was able to offer something valuable for my fellow low-level Tent players out there, and hopefully you'll be able to use this information to your advantage. Have a good day.